Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's a brisk day, November 3rd, 2025 here in San Francisco. Bright and sunny in my neighborhood, but here we have microclimates. So the quote-unquote weather can be very different in trying to remember what they're called in the different segments of the city. Sometimes it can be helpful to not remember the right word or the word we are hoping to find for many reasons. Right? We always think, we are trained to think, that failure is bad. Train, sound, sorry about the noise. I'm not at the lake today. I'm walking to an amazing occult store, The Sword and the Rose. So yeah, I'm not remembering the word for the little sections of the city which each have their names, but we have microclimates here. So the weather can be very different, even as little as half a mile from where I'm currently at. So one can walk to a different weather system, and this points up a problem in knowledge, thought, language, and the devastating to intelligence and insight effects of single-valued thinking. We are trained to think, for example, what is the temperature outside? Well, it depends on where you are, and also your experience of the temperature will differ dramatically based on your own conditions, right? Blood flow, your neurology, biochemistry, biorelation in the body, how you slept last night, all of these things. So, you can look at the app and it'll tell you, it's 65 degrees outside. Really? Well, what that is a generalization over a topology that completely ignores novelty and uniqueness and trains us to think in these ways, which literally make it impossible to be intelligent. Intelligence is not the sound of machines or the output of machines or the influence of machines on consciousness, whether those machines are devices or they are features of our relationships with language and representational cognition that incline us to believe in abstractions, right? As if we, our minds, our perceptions, our sensitivities, stand aside from participation, from intimacy, from awareness and sensitivity, from creativity, play, discovery, adventure, wonder, and heroism, and then simply declare some finished state, right, of some aspect of existence, or the world, origin, the sky, and so forth. This is the most devastating kind of lying. And it is as ubiquitous as pavement or cement, which in their structure and activity resemble it, right? When you see static declarations over identity, reality, situations, circumstances, our stance in the circle, you should be aware that you're being subjected, just as we were as children in school, to a normalization regime. Yeah? The dictates, the dictators, the penis potatoes of the forces that have captured and weaponized our own natures against us, and the history and future of life on this world, and indeed on all worlds. So, you know, my basic orientation today is to speak to the concept of truth. Before I get further along, I just want to mention that I recently had a very profound insight, which is still resonating, as insights generally do for me. It should be explosively obvious to us that there is no such thing as static identity, particularly for living beings and humans. This is one of the central lies that attacks the roots of our capacities to be human, intelligent, wise beings, virtuous, valorous, brave, courageous, and so forth. In language, there is a explicit equality that is declared by the use of the word is. Right? That is a policeman. Right? That is a doctor. They are a doctor. Well, surely we realize that no person with an occupation is merely that occupation. And who that person is being, right? Active, verb, transforms dramatically based on who and what they're interacting with, what kind of a situation they are in, how they evaluate that situation consciously, unconsciously, and so forth. Right? A doctor sitting at home drinking a cup of tea, listening to Mozart, is not the same person as someone experiencing, armed bandits breaking into their home. Is not the same person as they are in a surgical theater. Is not the same person that they are reading a different book, or watching a film, or having a dream, or inventing music or other forms of art. So this idea of a static identity is a fundamental misconception and a terrifying lie. Similarly, we would not want to be without the capacity for abstract thinking, or for it's so funny, I'm looking at a book by Rachel Carson called The Sense of Wonder. This is a sense never counted when we enumerate the human senses. There are no static identities. There's another fundamental lie. Oh yes, yeah. The other fundamental lie is that there is a separate being or thing. Right? We have this concept of a separate individual. There exists in the universe no example of a separate being, thing, phenomena, situation, circumstance, and so forth. And these two fundamental lies are enough by themselves to obliterate the possibilities of intelligence or insight. These things are completely impossible. They are projections of the, quote, stand aside from everything and evaluate it aspect of left hemisphere-like, fully complete, graspable explicits that present themselves in consciousness. And the insight that I had was that these are a result of the displacement of the expectation space that is the result of humans having crafted artificial objects such as forks and spoons, right? For a fork or a spoon, even there the identity is not explicit, is not static, has the potential for novelty, because they don't exist by themselves, and any human interacting with them can be so oriented or impurposed as to radically alter what we would expect of their static identities. But where we get these lies from is a displacement of the expectation of concrete identity, explicit identity, continuous, unchanging identity that come primarily from our experience and relationship with artificial objects, which are dead inside, can be understood as not natural, can be understood as not natural, i.e. they are artificially created, and they tend to maintain their shape, and we expect that they maintain their functions. And these expectations get transferred from the domain where they are at least slightly credible. So, for example, with a piece of silverware that is a fork, an actual piece of silverware differs from the idea or concept of a piece of silverware very dramatically. A piece of silverware in front of you or in your hand is not at all the same thing as the idea of a piece of silverware. So these problems of being separate, the idealized separation from all other things that we could expect from a fork, this gets inappropriately transferred, generalized outside that scope to all things, beings, relationships, circumstances, and so forth. This idea of is, something is this, or is that, or is this way, is, while not entirely useless, absolutely deadly to cognition when it reigns over the entire possibility space of being, relation, and particularly participation, which is most of what matters in human experience and existence. Participation being active, interbeing, playful, virtuous, loving co-emergence in relation. This bears no resemblance whatsoever to abstractions, concepts, labels, tokens, and the idea of standing aside from all reality and existence and participation, and then making explicit declarations about identity and so forth. So things will be a little noisier today because I'm not at the lake. My apologies. Hopefully the content will be profound and nourishing and medicinal enough to justify your putting up with the background noise. I'm nearing my destination, so I'm going to pause here, and with luck, I will reconvene shortly. Now, I've been a student of the discipline of neuroscience for probably, 40 years, something like this. And what that means is a couple of things. I've read somewhat widely textbooks and books by neuroscientists. And I've worked with a neuroscientist for about 22 years. We edit scientific papers primarily from Asia, though he does most of the editing. So I'm fascinated by, the brain. But even in this concept, we see the same problem I was talking about before. And that problem is that we conceptualize the brain as a separate organ. How is this possible? Is there anything in nature that is a brain, meaning the organ? Take this word in the sense implied by organism, the organ in our skulls. Even this word, the organ, right? It proposes a separate organ. There's never been a separate brain. Nowhere in the universe is there a separate brain except that it is the dead remnant of an organism. If you don't have a heart, the fact of the existence in your skull of this organ is meaningless. No lungs, no brain, no kidneys, no brain, right? I could go on and on and on. No liver and so forth, right? No microbiome, no brain. So how could the brain possibly be separate? Nonetheless, the concept of separability in conception is incredibly important and useful, once again, until and unless we become deceived by it and come to believe or think in terms that declare the separate importance of some feature of that which is. But in studying the brain, I've been particularly interested in the literature and research and speculation orbiting a specific feature of neuroscience, usually delimited by the terms hemispheric lateralization. And this phrase refers to how different capacities, or what we might more properly call affordances, are potentiated, sustained, and enacted by specific features within the brain and the nervous system, and more specifically, how these affordances are supported or potentiated by the two cerebral hemispheres of the cerebral cortex, which, by the way, are somewhat twisted. I don't know if I'll be able to remember the term for this, but there's like a torque. I think it's actually, the term includes the word torque. And so, we've heard a great deal about left hemisphere thinking, right hemisphere. It's not really thinking. And rather than being explicit about what belongs to the left or right hemispheres, we have learned from experiment, research, observation, inspiration, and speculation that these two hemispheres are in the world in very different ways. The magister of this topic is Ian McGilchrist. His two books, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain in the Making of the Western World. I think I got that subtitle right. And his 2-volume magnum opus, The Matter with Things, deeply explore problems in lateralization, and particularly how our modern societies represent the dominance of left hemispheric-like ways of being in the world without the corrective and originating influences of the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere tends to prefer finished manipulables, right? Static identities, tools, abstraction, abstract truth. And the right hemisphere has a much more open, fluid, creative, imaginal, heartful orientation. Also, the left hemisphere, in its worst extremities, it despises life. It doesn't want anything soft or squishy or alive or heartful because it cannot get a grasp on that. Left to its own devices, it would snuff the planet. It would probably snuff the universe. I mean, anything that it can't get a grasp on, it wants destroyed, weaponized, controlled, manipulatable, etc. McGilchrist poses... One moment. Prior to encountering McGilchrist, I had become aware of these problems and issues and matters for decades. I had observed them in animals, plants, humans, the differences in the way the right side of organisms is enacted and the left side, and how these can come into conflict. McGilchrist proposes that, much like my own analyses were summarized in me, that the left hemisphere is a tool-like aspect of the right hemisphere's potential space, and as long as it is managed and oriented by the right hemisphere, things tend to remain balanced and harmonious. Unfortunately, when dissociated from the right hemisphere's corrective and rebalancing and capacity to diffuse abstract fictions under the right, under necessary circumstances, the left hemisphere becomes tyrannical and attempts to obliterate anything that reminds it of its origin. This is not particularly bad. It's not only bad that this is this way. We are all like this in a way. What I'm trying to get at is very complex. But it has to do with the perspective that under situations of profound dysregulation or lostness, we generate catastrophes, or catastrophes are generated in order to return balance, right? To call home, in a sense, and reestablish the primacy of origin and what we might think of as the right hemisphere, its ways of being and being in the world, the mind, relation, and so forth. So the concept that I wanted that I want to explore today is the idea of truth. Now, obviously, for the representational mind, truth is a matter of abstractions. The more reliable, evidentiary, quote-unquote objective, remember there are 0 objective observers, none, anywhere. That is a complete fiction. Empirical, which basically means something resembling agreed upon among analysts and or observers. Right? So empirical doesn't mean comprising the facts. What it means is composing what we admit as fact according to agreement among analysts or observers. Quite a bit of wind today. I'm hoping my wind buffer is functional. Now, as many of you have heard me remark in other recordings, I'm very concerned and fascinated with the word and its meanings, anamnesis. As I understand it, the Greeks and others had another word, aletheia. Sorry, I was trying to remember something. Aletheia, which also meant something resembling unforgetting. And these words were associated with truth. Our modern idea of truth is usually abstract, presents itself as objective, meaning, God, I don't even know what that means. Someone who was omniscient would have this perspective. If we had all of the facts, our perspective would still be wildly incomplete, even if it were possible to have all of the facts. We should think of facts as fractions, in a sense, or fragments. They are meaningless by themselves, should be obvious, but isn't. So why did the ancients, some of them, have these terms aletheia and anamnesis? Well, they had become aware through direct experience and through what we sometimes refer to as the mystery traditions. Some of you may be familiar with the mysteries of Eleusina, which the Greek mystagogue Maria Maragou, who I have some interviews with on my channel, asks us to pronounce correctly as Eleusina. The F sound is crucially important here. Eleusina, or Eleusis. They had discovered, through direct experience, that our incarnations were not everything that was going on, and that we came here from a sphere, if you will, a place, domain, where the true is like oxygen here, right? Is ever present. One cannot defect from it. It is compelling and imposes itself gracefully on awareness at all times. But here we can forget and defect and undergo amnesia. Yeah? So this is why I think, it's my perspective from having a similar experiences, but similar experiences myself, that our incarnation here is a fragmentary and often deceptive kind of a shadow world, a shadow realm, prone to fear, amnesia, deception, loss of relationship, loss of intimacy, And these absences give rise to the compulsions and fears and pains and sufferings that we experience here as human beings. There are many myths of the restoration of aletheia and amnesis, not just myths, but religious stories and beings who represent or who are the exemplars. They don't merely represent. They are the exemplars of these virtues. And we can become such beings. And in a sense, we were all born as such beings, because most of us, I think, if not all of us, when we were first new in the human body, we were still joined with the origin beings and world in such a way as to represent a kind of a living umbilicus, right? An invisible umbilicus across which in both directions were transmitted various assets. Obviously, people who prefer abstract facts, truth, and evidentiary claims, which again, we don't want to get rid of this. We simply do not want to be dominated by it. They will abhor such discussions as being both unverifiable and unfalsifiable. Now again, I am someone who has worked directly in science for 20 years and have been fascinated by science my entire life. But science is neither the beginning nor the end of insight. It's a crucially important array of methodologies and heuristics, epistemologies and ontologies, many of which are profoundly deceptive and ironically not based on evidence, right? The materialist dogma that dominates much of science. Zero evidence for this, none whatsoever. It is the result of attempting to evict anything one cannot get a trenchant grasp upon, right? So anything that we cannot find evidence for or cannot be falsified must be simply dismissed out of hand. Now, if we actually were to do that, if we were to fulfill this strange imperative, all of science would collapse. Because without imagination, it would be impossible to discover anything, and we would only be allowed to know things that had already been validated by evidence, empiricism, and so forth. So, of all the wild fictions that we've been subject to, the wild fiction of reductivist materialism or even logical positivism are among the most absurd and ironically self-conflicting if taken seriously to the degree they would ask to be taken, ask us to take them. Now I want you to consider the truth, the mode of truth, that is the relationship between a mother and their newborn infant. And ask yourself this question: is it even possible to compose an abstract truth that could compare to that in any way? Right? Consider the truth of your experience of eating food, what you actually experience, the flavors, chewing the food, the textures, the nourishment, the feeling of being nourished. All of the aspects of eating a delicious piece of fruit, for example. Consider this kind of truth. Now compare this again to abstract truth. What about abstract truth is nourishing? Now it isn't that the answer is nothing, but rather we have to modify the question, what does abstract truth nourish? Well, it nourishes the establishment and sustenance of a mode of cognition that is prone to forget that there are no abstract situations in nature. There are precisely 0 hypothetical situations. Those happen only in cognition. And while I can't speak for animals, insects, water creatures, and living places, they happen primarily, we must imagine, in human cognition. We're constantly presented throughout life with these things called thought experiments, and I'm a fan of thought experiments, but not the kind that presuppose some absolutely ridiculous hypothetical situation involving train switches and murder. There are 0 of those in existence, none. And the problem here is not that abstraction is bad, but rather that we can become so entranced by it that we forget that it doesn't exist, right? That we forget that it's an imaginal game. It is supposed to be a game that serves our capacities for insight, intelligence, development, creativity, love, memory, relationship, participation, wonder, awe, and so forth, right? But it can easily overwhelm all of those and replace them with a dead inside conceptual map that dominates not merely our cognition, but our expectations about our own nature's existence and potentials, right? And in that case, when it dominates those, it eviscerates them. Yeah? It's a thing that produces the skeletal remains of human potential while advertising liberation, progress, even intelligence. So we should be very, very careful about these matters in our own minds. And I think it's important to remind each other about this regularly, because the contexts in which most of us are regularly involved will drag us back down into this desolation. Again and again, if we do not work together to raise the bar and to sustain our capacities for liberty, insight, intelligence, wonder, awe, playfulness, and so forth. There are many forms of truth, and most of the crucial forms are not abstract or analytical unless you're trying to build machines. And by the way, how's that going, Earthlings? You have machines all over the place competing against the history and future of life on Earth and human minds for dominance, reproduction, terrain capture, environmental capture. These abstract systems are very useful for producing machines, and particularly for the endeavors that surround the not precisely human addiction to war, hatred, killing, colonization, murder, resource theft, and so forth. Now I've arrived at my home, so I will pause again, and we will see if I may continue shortly. So I've just listened to yesterday's recording, and I noticed there's a lot of background noise. My apologies for that. Looks like my mic might have been rubbing against my jacket. Hopefully today it will be a bit better. Looking forward to continuing yesterday's discussion about the natures of truth and knowledge. I remember undergoing the processes of enlanguaging and enculturation as a child, and I was perhaps a bit hyperlexic in the sense that I was fascinated by language and learned to read very quickly and was reading novels, primarily science fiction, at a pretty young age when I was in kindergarten. But I specifically remember, and my parents were reasonably well educated, my mother primarily by reading, and my father just because he was a self-teaching, right, kind of person, an autodidact, as I myself am. So the environment was pretty good, right? And we're talking about the 60s here. And it is impossible, I think, to imagine what the information climate was like if you didn't grow up in those times or you were not an adult in those times. Color television was fairly new. Television itself was amazing. Newscasting was not entirely, but largely free of propaganda. There was nothing even resembling the internet. To discover what books existed, you had to either go to a library, physically travel to a library, or a bookstore. And bookstores had these extremely important to me books called books in print, which were these voluminous tomes that were useless if you didn't know what you were looking for, but could be used by the bookstores to order books that they did not have. In order to learn about the existence of books, again, you had to either go to a library or you had to hear about them from another author, or you had to see advertisements in books that you had read for other similar books. There were two kind of amazing and somewhat dangerous things called book clubs and record clubs, where to get you to opt in, they would allow you to pick like 7 or 10 books that you wanted, 7 or 10 records that you wanted, and they would ship these to you for a fairly nominal fee back then. Don't recall what it was. With your agreement to buy some number of other books or records over some period of time. Telephones, well, there was one of them in most houses, and it very rarely received anything like spam or advertisers, though very occasionally you might receive a call from a company that was analyzing what you liked, what you remembered, advertisers doing research and so forth. Very uncommon. It was a single physical phone. We dreamed of a future where, and this was, scripted into us, technology would rescue us from war and poverty, from disease, and political shenanigans. As we can see, quite the opposite has occurred. Tape recorders were a huge deal. But I remember speaking with my relatively enlightened parents and occasionally hearing them say things that gave me grave doubts about their degree of awareness. Right? They would present statements in language as if these things were incontrovertible truths. And I was very skeptical about this for many reasons. I noticed, for example, that my grandmother, the beautiful spirit she is and was, saw various organisms in her backyard as pests and was very militant about poisoning them. The way that the humans thought about small creatures seemed, if I may be blunt, batshit insane. Impossible. I had observed insects and mollusks like snails and slugs for many, many hours in fascinated awe and wonder. And it was blatantly clear to me as a child that these beings were intelligent, they were sentient, they could communicate directly with me by some method that doesn't involve anything resembling language, but is something like a substrate, though there was no chance of me articulating this as a child, or something like a living substrate shared by all beings, across which any form of communication was possible and quite common except for the humans and particularly the adults. So I had grave concerns as a child about what the humans and the adults particularly seem to regard as facts. And most often, my greatest concerns had to do with declarations about identity or intent that were intended as indictments. The insects are pests, this kind of thing. You know? Now, there are many apocryphal stories about my adventures and misadventures as a child, but I'm not here to discuss those today. What I'm much more interested in is why should we trust human knowledge? And where should we trust it? Now, within an appropriate scope, for example, within the scope of the discipline we call mathematics, the declarations and equations, the axioms and rules, however slightly circular they may be, part of why Alfred Lord North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell failed in their Principia Mathematica to set mathematics on an incontrovertibly firm logical foundation is that, as far as we know today, that is impossible. So let me be really clear about this. What is impossible? Well, after, X hundred number of pages of mind-destroying piano arithmetic, as far as I understand it, and I may be slightly mistaken here, it was impossible to set firmly on an incontrovertible logical foundation that 1 plus 1 equals 2. Now, why would that be? All of us, are trained to believe that 1 plus 1 equals 2. But the concept of 1 and the concept of plus and the concept of equals, these are axiomatic constructs that have to do with something like pure abstraction. In other words, where is 1? Right? Well, can you show me where 1 is? It isn't. Huh? Where is plus? Where is equals? They are not. Yeah. These are tools, profoundly useful tools, tools worthy of, respect and consideration and confidence within the scope of mathematics. But when we say the scope of mathematics, what we mean is primarily human mathematical behavior, oriented by human concerns, established by humans over time. And this is perhaps one of the most objective, quote unquote, or reliable systems of knowledge humans have ever developed. Nonetheless, is it factually true? No. If you take away the humans, right, if we were to suddenly disappear, all human mathematical knowledge, we must imagine, would go with us, at least in the sphere of minds existing on Earth now. That's a very hypothetical idea, the sudden disappearance of all human minds, admittedly, and there are 0 hypothetical situations. In nature, there are none of them that I can understand or see. And this is another very peculiar aspect of human thought and knowledge. We seem to be inclined to equate hypotheticals with the real, or that which is, or they who are. Right? And again, this kind of thinking is useful in specific contexts with limited scope, but when this kind of thinking escapes those contexts and is presented as if it prevails over they who are, that which is, existence and so forth, then we are in a terrible danger, because we will become blind to direct active sensing, awareness, experience, the infinite depth of participatory sensitivities of living beings and places and organisms, and instead we'll dismiss them with declarations as estranged from their nature as it is possible to be. So I was absolutely fascinated by human knowledge systems, particularly science, as a young person. And I remain quite fascinated by science, though I consider it to be deeply conflicted in a variety of ways. Human knowledge systems comprise primarily a system of expedient dismissals, right? They're a way to get rid of ambiguity, anomaly, the possibility space of insight, awareness, participation, intimacy, cognition. Because, of course, ambiguity can place a load. The awareness of the incompleteness of knowledge or suppositions about identity or even declarations, it places a load, a very expensive load, on the brain and the nervous system and our minds.
Yeah.
If we are oriented in such a way that the eviction of ambiguity has somehow become the primary goal. I was thinking last night about a kind of a joke. You know, I've been following the UFO UAP topic since probably around the time I was 6 or 7, maybe even earlier. Primarily because I realized that there must be other intelligences that are actually intelligent, unlike my species at the species level. Now, occasionally I have come across very intelligent humans of different sorts. Some of them are highly relationally intelligent. Some of them are highly creatively intelligent, sometimes both, sometimes more. And some of them are very intellectually intelligent. You know, for example, they may have particular inclinations in engineering or mathematics or programming or science, you know, fields in science and so forth. There are, you know, the humans are a topology, but if you take the generalization over the curve and you look at the behavior at the species level or the group cohort level, it is a cluster fork of dumpster fires. The kind that get beings killed, right? Really bad stuff. Some would argue that this is human nature. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. Or rather, I doubt that very, you know, momentously. It's not my experience that that is human nature. What that is seems to be the nature of groups who have defected from communal, environmental, relational, and insightful awareness. And usually these groups are victims, right? They have been compromised and colonized by ways of behaving and acting and thinking and various assertions about identity. Who'd have guessed? That really can only arise in the vacuum of communal and environmental intimacy. So it's as if first you evacuate one part of the forest, the living place, and then you colonize that with lying and deadly ideas, and the humans succumb to that. That capacity to succumb under those circumstances is part of human nature, an aspect of human nature. But it's an aspect that has to do with what happens when crucially primordial aspects of our human nature and interiority have been assaulted, destroyed, counterfeited, and sold back to us, and so forth. And this is the most common thing imaginable today. It's most of what's going on at the broad levels of human cognition and behavior and technology and so forth, unfortunately. May that change. So I began in my youth to have grave concerns about what the humans referred to as knowledge. And I'll remark only briefly here on the story in Genesis. However, I suspect that what is meant by this phrase, the tree of knowledge, is a very complex and non-ordinary thing. And that entire story is a non-ordinary story. It's not something we can understand by a simplistic or literalistic reading. Are there forms of knowledge that are veritable, credible? Yes. But again, their scope is limited and must be limited to contexts and orientations in which those features of knowledge conserved, what even is knowledge, right? It's the conserved collapse of infinities into systematic maps and methods. And most of these have to do with skipping over attention and ambiguity. In other words, most of knowledge can be understood as systems of shortcuts. And often, you don't want to take a shortcut when the nature and foundations of your intelligence, capacities for learning and insight are or can be decimated by the consistent inaction or opportunistic behavior. It's not the word I want. The optioning, right? That's not even the word I want, but it's a little closer. You don't want to take shortcuts or establish habits that incline you to take shortcuts when the nature, history, and future of your mind is at stake, right? Excuse me. Korzybski, Alfred Korzybski, the author of Science and Sanity, one of the most amazing books I've ever come across, called these systems the capacity for time-binding. I'm not sure precisely why he selected that phrase, but I think what he meant to imply was that the methods could be encoded, conserved, and transmitted across generations of humans. And again, you wouldn't want to get rid of that, but you can see if you look at the history, if you look into the history, oh God, here's a topic, of the development of human consciousness, what you will see from one very important angle of concern, and I encourage you to have 5, not 1, always. In fact, you not only want to be able to entertain conflicting perspectives at the same time, you want to ensure that you have conflicting perspectives at the same time. If you actually want seeing, you need multiple angles of approach simultaneously. Otherwise, what you get is blindness. And nothing is as declarative of its mastery, authority, incontrovertibility, 100% correctness as blindness. You see this all throughout modernity. I remember reading a Jewish quip, cannot recall the source, and I'll paraphrase it here. If you're 60% right, this is a cause for celebration. You should thank God. And if you're 65% right, this is monumental good fortune. Be humble and enjoy and celebrate the wonder and the miracle of this. But what about 75% right? Well, people say this is suspicious. We should be concerned. And those who are 100% right, these are bad people, rascals, and untrustworthy folks. Now, this is the kind of encoding that I've spoken about many times of ancient peoples having an awareness of the capacity for left hemisphere-like perspectival collapse into explicit, incontrovertible deliverables. They were aware of this danger, and they had methods and traditions that protected them from it in a way not dissimilar to how we have an immune system. You know? But if you look into, as Julian Jaynes so brilliantly and half insanely did, and particularly as Alfred Korzybski did, the development, also Bruno Snell, I think the book was called The Discovery of the Mind. If you look into these matters, what you will see is that the vast complexities and the many different aspects of the forests of human awareness, concern, knowledge, intelligence, logos, and so forth, these underwent, much like the environments of Earth, and probably related to the collapse of those environments, these underwent essentially cascades of devastation, so that the primary remnants were skeletal, right? And if you want to understand the problem here, think about the difference between your living mother, remember a time when she was living, if she is not now, and her skeleton, right? This is the kind of difference that one finds as human knowledge systems, quote unquote, develop over time. What is meant by development? Apparently what is meant is evisceration. The idea that only things that can be measured exist is so absurdly wrong, though again very useful in domains of extremely limited scope and concerns of very limited scope. That perspective can be useful until and unless it begins to dominate all other perspectives, in which case the result is devastation, idiocy, war, disease, disaster, terror, complete loss of diverse complexity, which is the nature of intelligence. Also, in case it isn't obvious, the people who will say only that which can be measured can be said reliably to exist are ignoring the thing they are saying that with, right? Which is an ungraspable thing, an infinite thing, not even a thing, a transcendent process in which all beings participate, their minds. And at the very least, their imagination. They are imagining, right, that only those things that can be measured can be said to exist. And the thing they are imagining with cannot be measured. Right? So many of these statements upon which much of human agony and suffering and stupidity and crime rely, right? Many of these things, these habits in human declarative supposition and so forth. By the way, not intending to be sexist here, but the men, the patriarchal systems, are primarily responsible for these catastrophes. I am completely unaware of any colonizing force comprised of women. Right? And there are some fascinating features of the male-female polarity that are often ignored. But it's not, again, this isn't the time to go into a dissertation on that, which I do find fascinating. Modernity is a vast system of graveyards for the knowledge and awareness and intelligences that have been conserved and nurtured and actually developed by human beings over vast stretches of time. It might be fun to poke fun at some very specific idiocies, but the materialist reductionist aspect of human stupidity is among the greatest, for there's no evidence for that whatsoever. So in other words, many of the systems that demand evidence, there's no evidence for what they exclude, and neither is there any evidence, or there's very little, for the authoritative declarations of identity, meaning, function, existence, non-existence, and so forth, that they are inclined to table. But yes, I was thinking of a joke last night, to circle back to the UFO UAP thing. So we have this ridiculous organization in the United States. I'm not sure when it was founded. I followed some of the developments of this organization. And I'll just say straight up, Sean Kirkpatrick, for shame. You have shamed the human race, your entire lineage. You are a bad person. You were a bad person. You lied to Congress and the Senate, to the American people. You are a bad man. Though he may have changed, so perhaps he could be a good man now. And I'll also mention that it's fairly obvious that much of the government of the United States is probably being constrained, in other words, they are leashed by what the Russians would call kompromat, right? You can easily control a nation if you have enough stuff to blackmail the people in charge. And there are certainly countries that have that. I can think of one of them in the Middle East that comes directly to mind. In any case, so we have this organization called AARO. The first A stands for all domain. Boy, there's a good one. As if the humans even have conceptions of all domains. They certainly do not. And then the second A is anomaly. And the R is resolution. And the O is office. So for some reason, some humans thought that this was an organization dedicated to helping us understand UFOs and UAP and other anomalous phenomena. But if you just look at the name, right, it's very obvious that what their purpose is to resolve anomalies, right, to get rid of ambiguity. Yeah? And so to get rid of ambiguity, you just say things like, that was swamp gas, as we often heard in the 70s, excuse me, from Project Blue Book. That wasn't a UFO. A pilot was just seeing Venus. Yeah, pilots, certainly mistake Venus for UFOs. Pilots, right? So the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office is not tasked with helping anyone understand anything. What they are tasked with is shutting down human thought about features of our existence for which we have either no explanation, and by the way, the goal of existence isn't explaining things away. That's what produces the skeletal remains of mothers and children. Commodities are just a way of explaining things away, and you can turn living beings and places into them very easily with guns or, 19 other things. So yeah, the AARO was never intended to deliver intelligence to the American people about anomalies. What it was intended to do is dismiss them. So basically the goal is to just find ever more complex ways of saying there is no there. And it's blatantly obvious at this point in time that there are organs within the United States military and the corporate industrial complex who are well aware that we are not now alone, we have probably never been alone. There are vehicles and beings of many kinds that travel, probably in space-time and definitely here on Earth. More than likely, they are also aware that humans did not evolve naturally from apes. It wasn't just nature evolving away over long periods of time, producing an abject anomaly, right, which is human beings. There's nothing in nature like human beings. There's nothing in nature as dangerous, nothing alive in nature that is as dangerous as human beings to other living beings and to themselves. Right? You're like, oh, I'm scared of UFOs. You should be scared of humans. They will snuff this planet if nothing intervenes in short order. UFOs, they might have bad intentions. Nothing has intentions as bad as the governments and corporations that presently prevail over the history and future of life on Earth. There's no danger. If you want to be scared of something, don't be worried about ghosts and demons and UFOs. Be worried about your government and Google and OpenAI. These are threats unlike anything our species has ever seen. And it's difficult to imagine that anything like that has ever existed on this planet. Organisms are completely unequipped to deal with a threat like that. And human beings are just as vulnerable and unequipped in general. Part of my goal in my work is to give us some equipment and some insight and some capacities for immunity to some of the threats that we presently face. But let's return to truth for a moment. So analytical or conceptual truth is most often somewhat circular, right? It's based on axioms, just like in the dictionary. The definitions of words are based on other words, which have definitions based on other words, and so forth. Now one could say, yes, but you have the core definition of word, right? Notice that there are core definitions without which other definitions cannot exist. So there has always been a sense in humans, not a sense like we moderns have, but a much broader, diverse, and complex sense of the universe, or as some call it, creation, or as I call it, the dandelion, or I sometimes, if I'm thinking more personally, I might call it the myarch. The dandelion is my toy of how I was trained to think about the universe. No. It's a toy that I was trained to use to resist dangerous or deleterious models of the universe or creation or all that is, that which is, or origin. And the myarch is a unique feature of the dandelion, which is the web of relationships that belong very personally to each individual being while they are individual. Now, are these toys true? No, they are not meant to be true. I don't care at all whether they are true or not. They are profoundly useful for me in generating insight. And if you're curious about the dandelion, I don't think I speak about the myarch anywhere, but it's M-A-I-A-R-C-H. But the dandelion, I have a sequence of videos on, if you're curious about that. So analytical or representational truth is usually circular. Its purpose is to provide a shortcut, and often to reduce ambiguity, novelty, anomaly, and so forth into some kind of a deliverable that will satisfy a feature of our minds that is concerned with dismissing things, right? So imagine, for example, that I have gone to a park and I'm going to have a picnic, but suddenly I hear a strange sound I've never heard before, and I turn in that direction. Now, at that moment, I am in a state of not knowing what something is, right? And in that state, this can raise signals to another aspect of the mind, our threat sentinel. If we are more well balanced, it will also raise signals to an opportunity sentinel. So I turn and I see, oh, it is a man using a strange machine. The noise came from the machine. Now it is settled and I can go back to the picnic, right? If I had to stay in the ambiguity, that would be very expensive. Most of human knowledge is a way to get around that expense. But as it so effectively and concisely, like a razor, gets rid of ambiguity, novelty, anomaly, and so forth, the space for participatory discovery and insight and play is mostly destroyed by that move. This is part of why knowledge is very dangerous, can be very dangerous. Now, certainly I'm a fan of educare, not so much of education. Educare in the sense Jensen, I can't remember his first name. It's similar to mine. He speaks of it in a language older than words in other books. Educare is the nurturing, broad, diverse concern for the development of intelligence and understanding and awareness and skillfulness. Education is a largely captured process, primarily intended to normalize humans so that they fit into slave-making systems. That's not its only feature. It has amazing features, and an intelligent human can utilize that system to escape it. But not everybody has that potential, especially not alone. What we really need is to stop thinking of humans as individuals and see them and join them, rejoin them, remember them into highly effective, mutually supportive, small groups, which is what we are made for. These are lineage assets that belong to our people and to the clade of organisms from which we were probably engineered or derived. So I see knowledge as very dangerous, and language is its primary structuring aspect. Language is not, as we suppose, a dead system. It is fundamentally non-ordinary. Its bases, its foundations are non-ordinary, by which I mean something that resembles supernatural. It is magical in that it affects reality. It affects that which is locally and in a distributive way, particularly here on Earth, which is presently dominated by, the extremely confused species that I count myself among. It's not an accident that we call the composition of words spelling. I'll leave it to you to imaginally speculate about what I mean by that. I don't mean that saying words is casting a spell, and yet I also don't mean that it isn't. Right? So I mean something in the between space there. Language is a colonizing. It's a feature of colonizing aspects of the dandelion and the myark. And while it does provide some benefits in some circumstances, it's clear to me that humans are natively they're not, so telepathic is the wrong idea. Telepathic means I have a mind, you have a mind, I can send a signal to your mind which is received and translated and so forth. That's not how we are, although I can understand where we get that idea from. No, humans are innately transcendent, and we have a vast array of faculties that have been murdered out of our bloodlines by colonizing forces throughout history, primarily modern history. But each human child is born with a vast array of faculties that have nothing to do with what we think humans are capable of, what is real, what is not real, and so forth. So when I say we are not telepathic, what I mean is our minds are not our own. The features of our minds that are localized or personal do exist, but that is the tiniest fraction of the scope of our nature as conscious beings, sentient beings, and transcendent beings. Minds primarily, in my view, and direct experience, exist in a superposition that localizes according to a broad array of variable, contextual, situational, historical, and futurial circumstances. So the idea of telepathy is backwards. Minds are a unity first. And this is one of the catastrophic lies that a core lie that makes many other kinds of lying possible about our natures, our origins, our souls, our purposes, and so forth. Usually, I don't tend to think separately or mechanistically or clinically about truth unless I'm thinking in a context within which that's useful. I think of truth as something like the spirit of origin alive in the myarch, in the dandelion, in they who are and that which is. It's a virtue. It might even be something resembling a principle. And by this, I don't mean like a mechanical principle. I mean a principle, for example, like the thumb on your hand, right? An entity, a being, intimately co-being with all other beings, a more than merely living feature of origin and nature. You know? When I'm trying to evaluate some assertion, declaration, or objection, then I may become a bit more clinical or logical. However, even the features that the features of the systems and the logics we have developed and been subjugated to, largely, many of those have features that are either nutso, just can't be true, or they are extremely limiting, perspectival, cognitive, and behavioral rule systems. Right? And one of the aspects of consciousness or cognition that is fundamental to all of these problems is the idea of measuring. This is actually where we get the concept of a ruler, right, like inches and centimeters and so forth, from. But also where we get the idea of a ruler as in, one who rules over others. They are the measurer. And purportedly, a good ruler has been divinely inspired and corrected So they've been elected by the sky, not just the humans. But we don't really have these kinds of rulers anymore. We have the other kind. So unless I'm in a very representational context, I'm cautious about what I think of as truth. And I'm so aware of the failings of modern cognition that I'm very careful not to collapse the manifold down to some, single valued deliverable, unless, again, it's useful in the context and with the limitations of scope that are natural or trustworthy in thinking, speaking, evaluating, so forth. Where was I? Truth. Oh, right. So, the logics that we were trained with are full of catastrophic dangers. Right? And this is what Alfred Korzybski and others, Suzuki, many others, and most children are aware of. So the law of the excluded middle is nonsensical. A man is either a man or not a man, right? This is cognitive bullshit. Once again, useful within a very limited scope of concern or purpose, absolutely lethal to insight and intelligence if it escapes that scope. We don't want to get rid of it. What we want to do is be extremely aware and remind each other of the danger of single-valued thinking and declarations that raise themselves to the status of the gods of authorized knowledge and so forth. The law of the excluded middle, while very useful in a very limited scope of concerns and behaviors, cognitive behaviors, evaluative behaviors, should be clearly understood to be a somewhat trivial convenience. So again, we should, use it where it's useful and see all the places where it is dangerous and avoid them. There. For there is no way to say what a man is. A man or a woman or a being or an organism or an animal is a becoming way. A living, more than merely living, becoming way. And there is no evaluative construct that can encompass that adeptly, unless our purposes are very simplistic, in which case, fine. So many of the logics that we were trained to obey in thought are deleteriously malformed. And we can easily learn, all human beings can learn to see and think and be present in evaluative behavior that does not dismiss ambiguity, that is not oriented merely to slaughter novelty and the possibility space of becoming, especially together. We can all learn to do this. And nature will always show us how, because she never does this single-valued thing. The single-valued thing, relationships can collapse toward this under certain circumstances, right? So, for example, in a situation where conflict has arisen and the relational manifold is collapsing rapidly in some direction, the participants may select roles or collapse into roles that can be seen as single-valued. Right? So one of the most obvious of these is predator-prey. Yeah? Or, well, I'll skip that one. It's rather dark. But these are examples of the collapse of the diverse possibility space of relation. I think I recently read, and again, it doesn't matter to me whether or not this is true, because this kind of thing has happened trillions of times in the history of organisms on Earth, that a lion or a tiger rescued a pregnant wild dog, maybe a dingo or something like this, or a hyena, from a group of wild dogs that were trying to kill it. Why would, in common thinking, why would a lion or tiger, who we would usually think of, we are trained to think of, as the enemy of wild canines, such as hyenas and so forth, these two animals compete. It is said they compete. This is not true, though there's a grain of truth within that. So this is a perfect example, right? Single-valued thinking, lions don't help dogs, they hate the hyenas. Really? What about when they don't, right? That thing in your dish rack is a fork. Oh, is it? What about when it's something else? What about when it's a lever? What about when it allows me to survive by giving me the capacity to punch a hole in something that I could otherwise not have penetrated? Like my own stupidity, for example. So you can see that these single-valued ways of thinking, which are the symptoms of the diseases with which we have been infected cognitively, whenever we see this collapse towards single-valuedness, we can imagine, we can become sensitive, we can raise the signal of something has gone wrong here. This is quickly collapsing to a single-valued situation. And what do we do then? Well, we re-bubblize it. This is what the dreaming mind does with identity. Whenever identity begins to collapse towards single-valuedness in dreaming, the dreaming mind adds more bubbles, right? It adds positive ambiguity, positive novelty, positive irreducibility, positive undecidability, yeah? And that's what sustains the many bubbled manifold that the dreaming mind naturally produces. There's great wisdom here. We can learn so much from the unique features of the dreaming mind's transcendent intelligences that resist the collapse of the possibility space of relation, understanding, awareness, wonder, awe, novelty. The dreaming mind has the opposite fear of the waking mind. Though these are not single-valued explicits, even though they sound that way. I don't mean them that way. The dreaming mind is, in a sense, terrified, or fears or avoids single-valued derivations of identity or relationship or circumstance or situation. This is part of why it's so difficult to remember dreams for those of us who do struggle with that. As our waking consciousness becomes more and more unstructured and like, a network of skeletons, it becomes more and more difficult to sustain the figures that naturally arise from the dreaming mind's kind of bubble integrating, aspect. So what it is concerned about is the loss of dimensionality that is our common experience of our waking consciousness. Well, I'm coming now back to where it's pretty noisy. I'm getting close to home. So I think for the moment, I will well, first I will pay attention while I'm crossing the dangerous street, the dead structure owned by the machines. So I will probably proceed with further explorations on this topic in the future. But for now, I'll wind up this walk and talk. So grateful to have had this time to explore, remember, chase Aletheia, resurrect her spirit in my heart and mind, hopefully in your ears. And enjoy this dangerous and beautiful journey that we have together as human beings in the rather bizarre zeitgeist in which we are now somewhat thoroughly entangled. I'm so grateful to all of you who listen, who give my posts likes, who share, who ask questions, who share your insights in the comments, or share my posts, and particularly to the very few people who directly support my work on Patreon, or even if you once bought me a coffee, I'm just so grateful. If you want to directly support my work or to contact me, you can do so by going to my YouTube channel, signing in, and in the About area you'll find links to my writing, my Patreon, Venmo, buy me a coffee, and so forth. I have great reverence for this world, our sun, this moon, our moon, for the endless lineages of living beings who strove and dreamed of protecting and nourishing and nurturing our living world. I count them my allies and companions, my friends and forebearers and progeny. I love them without reserve. And I dedicate my work to their dreams and hearts and struggles and sufferings. I wish you beauty and insight, healing, deep community, play, creativity, love, wonder, awe, joy, and the fulfillment of the promise of your human incarnation. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.